Welcome everyone to this launch webinar of the Center for Middle East and Global Order, CMEG. My name is Fathollah-Nejad. I'm the founder and director of this new transnational think tank that is headquartered in Berlin. I'm gonna just present a few things about CMEG in a minute, but before I would want to welcome you again to this launch webinar with our amazing speakers, Professors Azadeh Kian, Anoush Ehteshami, and Nadine Abdalla. I'm going to introduce them separately before they speak. And thank you so much for your immense interest. We had a lot of registration for this webinar, but the webinar is going to be recorded so you can check it out on YouTube later on. CMEG, as I said, is a newly founded think tank headquartered in Berlin with a lot of scholars all over Europe, but not exclusively. We have the mission of looking into key transformations that are underway on three levels, on the world order level, on the Middle East level, and specifically also on the Iran level. And this is why our speakers today will look at each of these levels in their talk. And of course, those transformations underway are both, related to geopolitical developments, new alignments, but also popular uprisings that have been, a constant feature in the Middle East for the past years. And what we also want to do as CMEG is to promote a new foreign policy that can bridge the gap between values and interests, since we believe that authoritarian stability as the paradigm that was underpinning Western foreign policy for the region has been quite fragile. So in the next days and weeks, we're going to present to you a number of publications spanning from risk assessments in the Middle East, but also the role of Russia and China in the dynamics of the region, and also a monitor of the Iran revolutionary process. So, just subscribe to our newsletter on cmeg.org, and we'll keep you updated. We also will have more webinars ahead. For instance, next week, we're going to have a webinar with our core Iranian team presenting our flagship Iran Futures program. But I'm going to also mention that at the very end. But for today, we are very delighted to have our distinguished speakers with us, who are also all of them affiliated with CMEG. You have, by the way, the newsletter URL in the chat. And each of them will present about 15 minutes. And then we're going to have the opportunity to include your questions that you can kindly write down in the chat, and that we're going to collect and post to the speakers. You can also tell us to whom your specific question is directed. So without further ado, I would start by introducing our first speaker, Anoush Ehteshami, who is a distinguished fellow with us at CMEG. He's a professor of international relations at the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. He's also the Nasser al-Mohammad al-Sabah Chair in International Relations and Director of the al-Sabah program in International Relations, Regional Politics and Security. Until last year, he was the director of the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Durham. And as you may know, his work is quite, well known globally. And I myself got very much intrigued about the Middle East in the context of globalization and geopolitics when reading Anoush's book back in the days, published by Routledge, which was quite, that actually prompted, my interest in this topic, which is also quite an ideational link to the creation of CMEG, after all. So we are very delighted to have Professor Anoush Ehteshami with us, and also as our distinguished fellow. And also in Durham, we're going to have a media partner, the Global Policy Journal, which will graciously provide us with a publication platform, which we also going to announce very soon. So Anoush will be talking about the systemic shift, China and the Middle East. Anoush, thank you again for coming on, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Ali, it's such a pleasure to be here at the inauguration of the center and to be sharing the platform with Professor Azadeh and Dr. Nadine as well, to whose papers I very much look forward listening. It's wonderful that you've launched this initiative, and you obviously have a lot of people that are behind you, supporting you, and I think we as fellows are duty bound to also do our bit and make sure that this succeeds in the interest of Europe and also the wider region globally as well. And thank you for inviting me to speak today as well. It's always nice to go down in history, but you did age me a bit when you said way back when the book that I've written on Asian Hassan had made an impression. That's the sort of thing that should go in the obituary as well as marking the day today. So you've given us little time, but the good news is that you can't reach me, Azadeh or Nadine, so we can speak as long as we like, and there is little you can do about it. But as I'm very keen to listen to Azadeh and Nadine, I will behave myself and speak for the period that you've asked us to do. So systemic shift, let me very quickly talk about the origins of systemic shift, because this is underpinning much of the discussions that follows. Basically, it's a process we're talking about, which started with Japan as being the trendsetter from the late 1960s through the 1980s, when Japan then started to flatten as a major economy. What Japan did was shift the focus of economic growth and development, but also modernization, from the Euro-Atlantic, from Europe and the United States and Canada, way eastwards. It was, you could argue, unprecedented. Japan had done that before, of course, before the war with the Meiji Restoration, but this was unique in the way that Japan transformed the whole notion of development and economic activity. And Japan was soon followed by what we call the NICs, the newly industrializing countries, mostly in Asia: Thailand, Taiwan, Republic of Korea, Singapore are the ones that we often cite, but also places like Brazil, like Chile, like Argentina were part of South Africa. Even Iran was part of this process of that time, the 1970s. And they were instrumental in beginning to create new nodes of economic activity and development outside of the Atlantic area. And then they were augmented and supplemented, if you like, by what the World Bank called the capital surplus countries. It was the first time in modern world that we'd had developing economies which were actually capital surplus. What did that mean? It meant that countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like UAE, like Kuwait, like Oman and Bahrain in those days, but also to a lesser extent, Iran and Iraq had far too much money that they could absorb in their economies following the oil boom of the early 1970s. Put these together and you begin to sense that actually the world economy is changing. There is a transformation taking place, and much of it is taking place in the global south, but it's being supported obviously by forces beyond the global south's control. So what is the catalyst for systemic shift? Ideally, I would argue is a kind of a condition created and encouraged by stagflation in the Old West, Europe and the United States in the 1970s, and also the end of the gold standard, which removed restrictions on currency mobility and foreign direct investment. And of course, what we call the transnational corporations capitalized on these capital movements and these global developments to begin to locate their activities in parts of the global south. And it is in response to that that we see quite a rapid change from what had been the model of development in Global South, which was called the import substitution industrialization strategy, to an export substitution industrialization strategy. Places like Korea and Singapore and others began to actually champion this process. So systemic shift is about geography, it's about economic transition, it's about geopolitics, but also ultimately, Ali, it's about power, and it's about power transition. What it means, in essence, today is a major dislocation of economic and geopolitical power from the Euro-Atlantic eastwards. And I say eastwards for now because actually there are ways in which you can locate the pendulum, how far east the systemic shift has gone. And the last look that I took was it had now gone east of Iran's borders. There was a time 30 years ago that the weight of the global economy was actually still on the edge of the Atlantic in Europe. So you can see how quickly the weight of the world economy has shifted. That symbolizes, if you like, systemic shift. It means the transfer of the weight of the global economy from the Euro-Atlantic to East Asia, but increasingly to South Asia. India is now being groomed as this new giant of this century, but also Southeast Asia, the unsung heroes of globalization and systemic shift. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and so on have played a critical role in acting as hubs for industrialization, economic activity, and such like. Systemic shift also has facilitated and accelerated what are called Asianization of Asia, which also had begun in the 1970s. I'll park that there for a minute. I'll visit it in a little while. Secondly, why focus on China? Let me just cite the obvious first. China is the world's second largest economy. It has become one of the fastest growing economies in the world since the 1990s, and has become the factory of the world as well as being a marketplace of the world. It is a massive exporter, but because it is a massive exporter, it's also a massive importer. So to put that in perspective, on the eve of the pandemic in 2020, China was contributing 30% a year, every year, to global economic growth. Put that in context of the number of countries on the planet, of the size of economies on the planet, and then look at China as embodiment of this massive transformation. And the second piece of evidence is that when you look at China's economic activities, year on year, China exports $2.5 trillion in just goods to the rest of the world. It is a giant beyond comprehension and comparison. So to be this successful, China has become extremely globalization dependent. So what happens to China's economy affects us, but also what happens to us affects China. We are in a truly interdependent global environment that we have given to China, but we are now beholden to China to sustain for the foreseeable future. And China is the only country outside of the West to have cultivated and built a global network of partnerships. China is also the only country on the planet that can claim a peer power status with the United States. And to cap it all, of course, China's Belt and Road Initiative that I mentioned several times going forward is effectively proving to be world shaping, if not world changing. Why we're looking at China, in addition, is because China has taken a deliberate decision to pivot westwards. That is interesting because much of the world has had a pivot east thus far. Even countries that sit in Asia, whether it is Iran, whether it is Saudi Arabia, whether it is UAE, but also further east, even India has developed a look east strategy. It is interesting that it is China which is looking west by way of trying to create these bonds between these networks across Eurasia. And why is China pivoting eastwards? Firstly, because China has become a net importer of energy, of oil, since 1993. That has had a dramatic impact on the way in which China now looks at the rest of Asia. but also post-Cold War, 1991, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, both combined, has opened up mainland Asia to other Asian countries. And China has taken advantage of this to push its weight into Central Asia, into West Asia, what you call the Middle East, but also in South Asia as well. China has become unbound in the way that is developing its links. But also it began in earnest in the 2010s as the Western markets began to saturate and also stagnate, to look for new markets in non-OECD countries, in Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and of course in Latin America. But in this context, it is Central Asia and West Asia which have emerged as key providers of fuel, but also much raw material and also investment for China. And then, of course, there is connectivity from the old Silk Road that China celebrated as a way of binding these bonds with the rest of Asia, to the new Silk Road, to the OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiative, and now finally the Belt and Road initiative, which is now, we're now commemorating, marking its 10th year since it was launched by President Xi Jinping in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, as it happens, in 2013. BRI arguably is Eurasia changing, and it's a critical component of China's strategy in Eurasia moving westwards. And Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia are vital to the geopolitical economic links that BRI is now aspiring to create. There is, in a sense, the dynamics of Asianization of Asia, which is taking place now along 6 important axes. With my eye on the clock, Ali, I'll run through these very quickly. What are these 6 axes? First of all, energy trade, which is really underscored China and Persian Gulf's relations with China and wider Asia. But also there is energy and oil-related investments which are coming forth in petrochemicals, in refining, in derivatives, and so on. Second axis is non-energy trade and investment, AI, communications, infrastructure development, finance and health, and so on. The third axis is military and security relations, which started largely with Iran, but also in the 80s with Saudi Arabia, when China provided in secret ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia in the 80s, but it's now spread right across into other countries as well. Now includes the UAE, Egypt, Israel's links with China in military security are well known, and so on. The fourth axis is diplomatic exchanges, and there are 4 or 5 ways in which we can cite these. The first is China producing its Arab policy paper way back in 2005. It has created these comprehensive strategic partnerships. If you count them up, you'll see there's a whole bunch of them in this part of the world. There are also the so-called special partnerships. There is the 25-year-old Iran-China agreement. There are the China GCC summits. There are the China Arab summits, and so on, that all trickle into creating these thick networks of diplomatic exchanges. Then fifthly, there is people-to-people exchanges. It started with tourism, but right now in Dubai, there is a China Arab Entrepreneurs Forum taking place, the first one of its kind. So people-to-people just doesn't mean people traveling for fun, but also there are business linkages which are being developed and created. And last but not least, the cultural and education ties on which China is very keen in terms of exporting its soft power. So what are the key drivers of convergence here? I've already mentioned energy. Secondly, markets. GCC, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, Israel are all substantial markets for China in very different ways. There is access. China is very conscious of choke points that affect its economic access to the rest of the world, whether it's the Malacca Strait, whether it is Bab el-Mandeb, whether it is the Suez Canal, whether it is the Strait of Hormuz. China needs to have access to these choke points, and access is vital. which feeds into the BRI, because BRI is not just about access, but it's also about transit and destination. West Asia, North Africa, and Europe provide these dimensions, fill the gaps, if you like, in China's access and connectivity exercises. And of course, they help China secure supply chains. What all this means, in essence, is that China has arrived big time into this part of the world. But that doesn't mean that the West has necessarily left. And I want to leave us with one thought, that transition doesn't mean displacement of powers at the global level. What it means is a shift, a steady shift, an evolution of process that creates opportunities for some new actors, but also means that the old actors have to adjust. This is not about the rise and fall of empires, but it's about a process of change in a very integrated world that now puts China at the heart of action. I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anoush, for this fascinating talk. If I may just ask you one question about it. You fantastically explained to us the systemic shift that is very much based on the center of gravity of economic activity shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And one of the great questions is that how is this geoeconomic center of gravity shift translating into geopolitical shifts? So what are the factors you would look at in order to have an answer to this question? Because if you look at the sources of power, for instance, you see that, for instance, the United States has still very much, is very much dominant in the financial and banking sectors, and also in the military realm. So those are potentially two areas where the US is still very much at the helm. So how do you see this developing, also perhaps in view of a more strong foothold of China in the Middle East?
I think it's still about the transition, Ali. I think there is still early. It's been going on for about 20 odd years, but it is now that we're beginning to see the strongest nodes of this not taking root. Certainly in West Asia and possibly the Mediterranean. I think it's maybe too limited to look at it as a rise and fall relationship. I think it's much more about China discovering the need to maintain access to key markets, to develop those key markets, and also to create opportunities for what is dangerously the prospects of overcapacity and overcommitment at home. China, if you like, the BRI is partly a result of China being able to export capacity to the rest of the world. It's an efficient way of doing that, not just in building those things, but also in using them to get the goods out into those areas. But also it's about consolidation, about making sure that China is the strongest of these emerging powers and established powers in Eurasia. China's game is very much about Eurasia because it recognizes that so long as the United States dominates, if you like, the Atlantic world, and that world remains in part beyond China's reach, it is this dynamic part of the world that China needs to be playing a very active, much more intrusive interventionist role in. And that we're beginning to see in the Iran-Saudi Arabia kind of dialogue, détente that China signed off. China didn't initiate it, China signed it off. But symbolically, it means that China has arrived. But as you alluded to yourself, it doesn't mean that China is here to replace the United States. And the only country that is hoping for that is actually Iran. The rest of the region wants to have, certainly, the GCC countries and Egypt and Israel and so on, want to have the United States present as a military guarantor of the security. But what they don't want is for that to happen at the expense of their economic prosperity and partnership with China. And the good news is that China and the United States share so much interest globally, but also in this region, that they also will want to avoid an either-or dilemma. The problem is that at the moment, because of Russia's aggression invasion of Ukraine, we are beginning to posit the issue in terms of authoritarian versus democracy. I think if we shift that lens slightly, you can find that many of the global South states can readily identify with stability and rule of law that the US is wanting to present, rather than the struggle between democracy and autocracy. If that language changes, then you will see that actually this polarization of ideas can be submerged and if you like, consumed within a dialogue of partnership that looks at development of, United Nations has reckoned that it will take about $10 trillion to develop the infrastructure of Asia and Africa. So if China is there to build much of that, the West recognizes it will benefit from that. But also the West itself has put in motion some of its own strategies of connectivity. The EU has, United States has, India has, and Building Back Better, a cumbersome term, is implicitly talking about the importance of connectivity and networks. China is a master at this, and you can see opportunities that the West can partner China in creating development and growth for the global South. So if the global South sees this, you can assume that both Beijing and DC can begin to recognize this. And I dare say at the end that actually when we heard the communique at the Hiroshima G7 summit, President Biden alluded to the fact that there is much more in common with China than what divides the West from China.
Thank you so much, Anoush. Fascinating and very incisive. Thank you so much. We're going to now move to the Middle East, most specifically to Cairo, where we welcome our Senior Associate Fellow, Dr. Nadine Abdalla, who is an Assistant Professor in Sociology at the American University in Cairo at AUC. And she also has a Berlin link. She was a visiting scholar at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, which is the main think tank here in Germany, affiliated to the government, the German Institute of International Affairs. And she's going to talk about the key transformation that has been shaping in the Middle East for over a decade now, in terms of the popular uprisings, normally referred to as the Arab Spring. There are other scholars, for instance, Gilbert Ashkar, who call it a long-term revolutionary process. And she's going to have a presentation about the lessons to be learned after 12 years of the Arab uprisings. Nadine, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours. And she's going to share with us her PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you so much, Ali. I'm so happy to be here in the inauguration of this wonderful think tank. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm going to share now my presentation. 12 years has already passed on the first wave of the Arab uprisings and 4 years on the second one. So did this revolt succeed or did they fail? In my short talk today, I don't think that I would aim to answer this question, but I would rather present some thoughts which could serve as a brainstorm on the dynamics, the transformations, and current outcomes of these uprisings, as well as the possible lessons learned from them. So I think that the first lesson could be that reforming state institution is a key. Right after the Arab uprisings, protesters focused on holding new elections and getting a new democratic rule. However, the reform of state institution was not given such a priority. Here I would say that this unreformed institution supported the presence of authoritarian ruling and hindered the state capacity to deliver to its citizens. This in return undermined the appeal of democracy in the region in a sort of vicious circle. Hence, today I believe that reforming inefficient institution or collapsing state institution is necessary for any potential political change. second, I guess, that elections are not democracy. So agreeing on the rule of the game should come first, or precisely before proceeding to elections. Elections were held in a contested framework in Egypt, for instance. The electoral game in 2012 was freely played, but the rules of the game were contested between the different political stakeholders. This has led to conflicts and backlashes toward authoritarian governance instead of democracy. Also, through elections, the old regime may reproduce itself with new names. In Iraq and Lebanon, for instance, relatively free and fair elections serve only to reinforce corrupted sectarian regimes. Third, closing the space open it for radical violent groups. And here a question should be asked. Why did radical Islamist movement erupt in the countries that witnessed the Arab uprisings? And here I think that we cannot separate this from the result of several Arab political changes. This has actually strengthened the argument of this radical group, which is that there is no possibility to reform the state without resorting to violence against it. Also, the absence of clear rules for the transitional period, as well as the absence of the possibility for a fair competition, created a great polarization, which opened the space for verbal and actual violence. In some cases, such as the case in Syria, the incapacity of civilians to defend themselves from the regime violence and repression created a functional need for the presence of radical and violent groups. Social media may dismantle an authoritarian rule, but can bring democracy. So during the Arab uprising, social media was obviously an important tool that enabled movement to push authoritarian regime to step down. However, when the time of building democracy comes, the internet served only to increase polarization. Actually, through algorithm, filter bubble, cluster of like-minded people was formed. They rarely interacted, but every cluster spread and believed its own narratives and framing of events. The mobilization of fear thus replaced the mobilization for consensus. This was experienced in the post-2011 revolutionary Egypt, as the formation of such clusters only prevented compromise making between the main political actors and their constituencies. In the same vein, in post-2011 Syria, the spread of these narratives of hatred didn't only prevent a consensus building, but also helped promoting violence and sectarianism. Fifth, social media unveiled true preferences, but also support their falsification. So due to the virtue of relative anonymity, social media makes preference falsification less likely as the cost of unveiling true preferences decrease. This was clear at the outbreak of the Tunisian uprising, knowing that Tunisia was a closed society. However, also non-democratic actors, regimes, by profiting of the same virtue of anonymity, succeeded also to spread disinformation or to promote their own counter-democratic narratives via social media. By doing this, they managed to create bubbles of fake preferences. These false preferences push sometimes a certain amount of user to believe that their thoughts are disapproved by others and hence refrain from engaging in oppositional actions. Six, neoliberal policies are rather the problem, not the solution. The principle that economic liberalization leads necessarily to political liberalization, I guess, should be revisited. Actually, the acceleration of economic liberalization, whether before or after the Arab uprising, has just led to political deliberalization. I believe that an exclusive focus on market-driven strategies for growth, combined with the marginalization of socioeconomic rights, excludes several segments of the society from the political equation, and this basically prevents the formation of an infrastructure to democracy. Therefore, assessing the shifts in the socio-political distributional alliances is crucial to determine the potential democratizing impact of any economic change. 7, free trade unions should be at the heart of any project for change. With the acceleration of neoliberal policies before the Arab uprisings, workers protested against privatization, deregulation, as well as against the power conferred to employers. In that context, the movement of independent trade unions emerged in countries with a tradition of trade unions that were controlled by the state, such in Egypt, Lebanon, and Algeria. This movement sought to defend the workers and represent their grievances. Here, I believe that such representative trade unions strengthen the civil society against the presence of a counter or present a counterpower to powerful elites. And this has been seen already in Tunisia. Therefore, free trade unions are an important component for a strong infrastructure to democracy. 8, forgotten actors are the urban poor. And here I take the definition that provided by Al-Sabah. Urban poor are those low income, low skill, low status, and low security working people who largely navigate informal life and labor of precarious nature. Actually, the Arab uprising cannot be understood without looking at those poor who were main but forgotten actor of the uprisings. The urban poor consider their participation in the uprising as a continuation of their daily struggle for an urban citizenship or for an inclusion in a city whose policies push them consistently to the margins. While those urban poor felt a great ownership of the revolutionary process and of the city right after the Arab uprisings, the current ruling elite either continue to neglect their aspirations or fail to integrate them in the political system or even repress them, a fact that may generate very dangerous outcomes. Finally, a new citizenship imaginary remains in the making. I think that the Arab uprisings have opened the door for a new imagination of a nation which enhances collective welfare. If we analyze revolutions in a political and macro structure terms, focusing on governing coalition at the top, it would be hard to consider the Arab uprising as a success, of course. However, if we consider looking below at the setbacks of fear and polarization, combined with the more positive transformations happening in people, subjectivities, and practices at the local level, we may perceive some changes. As al-Mohammad stated, a revolution is a condition of rupture in the routine of life that may give rise to open-ended possibilities, a condition in which people may come to imagine a different order of things. And here I would say that this imaginary remains in the making as it gets shaped continuously with the setbacks and challenges people still confront and the small successes they also come to achieve. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking so much forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for this most fascinating tour de force about a lot of very important lessons to be learned within this revolutionary process, as you called it. So it seems that the structural problems are still very much here. Is there a chronology of importance that you would tell activists or tell academics to look, especially into of the factors that you mentioned?
Okay, this is a hard question, but just as a first glance, my mind would tell me that both neoliberal policy is not the solution and election are not democracy, just are the two things that just come to my mind when you ask this question. So those two bases. So basically, do not just start by elections, but agree on the rule of the game and structure the system you would like to be part of. And second, think of the political, the economic system that you would like to settle with the participation of the people in this economic system.
Shukran. Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you so much. And we should have much more time to talk about all those issues. Actually, I'm quite fascinated, to be honest. But last but not least, we're going to have our distinguished fellow, Professor Azadeh Kian, with us from Paris. And of course, Professor Kian is well known to many. She's probably the prime expert on Iran in France. She's a professor, a distinguished professor of sociology and a director of the Center for Gender and Feminist Studies and Research, CEDREF. And it's of a journal, Les Cahiers du CEDREF, at Université Paris Cité. And she has been the author of a multiple of important books regarding Iran and the question of gender. And in 2019, she published in French, Femmes et Pouvoir en Islam, which is Women and Power in Islam, which is also quite interesting given the developments that we've seen in Iran since last fall. And a book that I very much enjoyed reading was published right after the 2009 Green Movement, which is L'Iran, un mouvement sans révolution, la vague verte face au pouvoir mercanto-militariste, which is Iran, a movement without revolution, the Green Wave, or which is the Green Movement, facing a mercanto-militarist power. And she's going to have a new book out in August, I believe, which is going to be published by Bloomsbury. And it's going to be entitled Rethinking Gender, Ethnicity, and Religion in Iran, an Intersectional Approach to National Identity. Of course, all of them very important topics that are discussed not only by Observers Iran, but also beyond. Her talk today gonna be called the Transformational, Intersectional Impacts of the Ongoing Revolution in Iran. Without further ado, Professor Azadeh Kian, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Ali. I'm very honored to be here at the inauguration of CMEG and also to be a fellow of CMEG. So my talk would be really focusing on Iran's events nowadays, and especially since the murder of Jina Mahsa Amini, who was a Kurdish Iranian woman who was arrested in Tehran by the morality police for improperly wearing the veil, and then she was beaten to death on 16 September 2022, and then this provoked major demonstrations of anger and protest throughout the country. Contrary to previous social movements, I believe that we now witness a revolutionary process in the sense that we now witness people wanting to change the social order. And this has been set into motion at least ever since last September. If I compare it to the Green Movement, for instance, of July 2009 against the massive electoral fraud in the presidential elections, this was also a social movement, but it attempted to reform the system from within. It expressed the specific demands of the educated middle classes, both men and women. The demands had already been heard by also many women, for instance, for gender inequality, women's rights activists, for instance, through their several campaigns, such as the 1 million signature campaign or the White Scarf campaign, and so on. Though the Green Movement was a political movement, it was structured and was driven, as I mentioned, by the urban educated middle classes, and its leaders were those who were from within the regime, and some of these leaders are still under house arrest. The actors of this movement were endowed with both social and economic capital. They rejected violence, they aspired to peaceful change, and they sought also to establish democratic bases and try to transform the system from within through free elections and participation in an institutionalized political space. Since the revolution, there were a wide range of tendencies and factions within the Islamic regime with different, even divergent ideologies and interests that had wrongly suggested the possibility of political alternation and the viability of democratizing the system. The Green Movement, nonetheless, was crushed, Tens of protesters were killed, 5,000 of them were arrested and imprisoned. Many women NGOs were closed down, and a lot of the people who were involved in the Green Movement had to were forced into exile. Another important social movement was in January 2018 and then November 2019, following the threefold increase in the oil prices. And these were spontaneous revolts that broke out and expressed actually the aspirations of the urban poor. So here you see that the urban poor in Iran played a major role in these two important uprisings. So these were urban poor, lower classes, and so on. And they urged demands for economic, political, and social change. And these two, 2018 and 19, were probably the first class revolts since the Iranian Revolution. Because these people, the urban poor, are hit hard by unemployment, precariousness, poverty, and they have virtually no prospect for the future. And also, there is amongst them a deep sense of injustice linked to corruption and the plundering of the national wealth by a minority in power. The protesters had nothing to lose, contrary to people who were involved in the Green Movement, and they were very angry at the entire institutions and political factions, both conservatives and reformers. You know, the toll was very heavy. Hundreds were killed, many injured, thousands were arrested, and so on. But authorities once again succeeded to harshly suppress the popular protests. What was very important in these movements, this 2018 and 19, was that the urban poor, many of whom used to be the pillars of the regime, started really to protest against the regime. And then nonetheless, given the extent of the economic crisis, youth unemployment, poverty, and so on, the protests continued, but women did not play a major role in these protests, contrary to the Green Movement. The presidential elections of June 2021 took place, therefore, in a context of general political, economic, and social crisis and discontent. Of course, I should mention that in 2018, President Trump pulled the US out of the JCPOA, which was signed in 2015, and also imposed important sanctions against Iranian oil and gas, which also aggravated, I should say, the economic crisis. So the ultra-conservative Ebrahim Raisi, who was the candidate of the leader and the current president, was also a member, or had been a member, of the Death Commission that ordered the execution of thousands of political dissidents in 1988. And so when he became president, the power became Talibanized, and the ultra-conservatives further restricted individual and collective freedoms, and they continue to impose their conservative values. The police and the militia, the Basij, are given carte blanche to suppress civil disobedience and protest activities. The repression of protest activities, the imprisonment of many human rights, women's rights, and so on, activists, and also the restriction of or limitations that are imposed on women's rights, for instance. I don't have the time to get into the examples, but there are a lot of them, are examples of the Talibanization of power, for instance, encouragement of early marriage, impediments toward women's access to the job market, and more recently, the attacks, chemical gas attacks against school and high school girls, many of whom have been, thousands of whom have been intoxicated. So the current ongoing revolution has several, as I mentioned, peculiarities comparing to the Green Movement and the 2018 and 2019 movements, in that first, it is intersectional, and it very quickly spread to various social groups, both the urban poor, the middle classes, and so on, and even some peasants who are involved, to different ethnicities, genders, and religions across the country. So this is one important peculiarity. The majority of the Iranian society is educated, open to the outside world, but suffer from lack of freedom, poverty, unemployment. Actually, according to official statistics, over 50% of the Iranian population now live under poverty line, and also corruption of an oppressive ideological power. And so the people who are involved in this ongoing revolution reject the entire regime. They have no hope of reforms anymore. And they also reject political Islam and its imposed precepts, and they demand the separation between religion and the state. These are all slogans that we hear, or we have been hearing in all these gatherings. Another crucial transformational impact of the ongoing revolution is the emergence of a new inclusive definition of Iranianness. Under the Pahlavis, the social hierarchy was based on Persian identity and basically male identity and belonging, to the detriment of other ethnicities and genders. Under the Islamic regime, the Shiite dimension of Iranian identity is emphasized at the expense of other religions, including Sunnis, who are very much involved, by the way, in the current movement. And women, of course, are subjected to the neo-patriarchal authority of men. Thus, under the current regime, Shiism over-determines individuals and tends to legitimize structural power relations based on gender, ethnicity, religion, or class. Women and other minorities as major agents of change need nonetheless to beware not to be betrayed again, this time by the return of the Orientalist discourse on national identity. The emerging neo-nationalistic discourse, especially among the diaspora, needs to be scrutinized and criticized. Through acts of resistance and civil disobedience, a growing number of women try to get control of their destiny, including their bodies and sexualities. Through performative acts, they transgress Islamic norms, unveil and refuse to hide their bodies, and utter the urgent need for freedom. In the ongoing revolution, where women have emphasized their importance as political stakes, women life freedom, borrowed from the Kurdish feminist movement in Turkey, has become the major slogan in all demonstrations and gatherings targeting the Islamic regime. Islamic laws and institutions that reinforce social, ethnic, gender, religious, or class inequalities are being challenged precisely because they are at odds with social realities and new social, demographic, political, cultural behaviors, especially among the younger generations who are very open to the outside world and know what's going on elsewhere. A consciousness has stemmed from the emerging revolutionary practice, or the interdependency of different strengths, according to which democracy, freedom, and social justice are closely intertwined with gender, ethnic, religious, and class equality. Although the Islamic regime is not in danger of falling in the short term, mainly because or due to the refusal of the military and the discontent but silent majority to join hands with the protesters, the ongoing revolution has shaken the regime's foundations. The recent rapprochement with Saudi Arabia or signals sent to the US and Europe to resume nuclear talks with the hope to lift American sanctions are examples of the Islamic regime's weakening and its attempts to protect itself from its own population. Let me remind you that it was the ultra-conservatives, the ones who are in power today, who in 2016 attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran and provoked the rupture of diplomatic relations between the two countries. And it was also the leader who in 2022 imposed demands preventing talks from resuming in Vienna and finally ordered the Iranian negotiators to leave the nuclear talks. The killing of over 550 demonstrators, including 71 children, the majority of whom were from Baluchistan and were Kurds also, and the arrest of over 2,000 people, including many leaders of the autonomous trade unions and councils, trade workers, teachers, students, women's rights activists, and so on, who had organized the demonstrations, and the execution of several of them in prison, including the 3 young men who were executed recently, have slowed down the ongoing revolution, but will not be able to prevent its success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kian, and it very much echoes my own kind of, thinking about what has been happening in Iran ever since the day protests. And it seems that you see indeed a new quality with the uprising of starting in last fall. And I know that you partly answered this question at the very end, but what would you respond to those who may who may interpret of what is going on in Iran as a seasonal, phenomenon, as people had interpreted the Arab Spring as an Arab Spring followed by an Arab winter, and then everything going to be over. So, what would you respond to, to questions saying that, well, we had between mid-September of last year and the end of last year, we had relatively high number of street protests, but ever since this year, we've seen, very little street protests. So how would you respond to this kind of seasonal interpretation of what is going on in Iran?
Well, actually, as I mentioned, I think that this is very different from previous social movements. Iran is one of the most, one of the countries in the world with important numbers of social movements in, contemporary Iran, actually. But this one is very different because, first of all, you have different genders, you have different ethnicities, you have different social classes who are participating or have participated in the movement, although those who did participate in the demonstrations were basically youngsters. But as you know, 70% of the Iranian population is under 40, so it's not that surprising if we see a lot of young people. But anyways, those who took the streets were the ones who basically were young, but probably, as I mentioned, were from the urban poor, but also from middle-class youth with different demands. The demands that we heard were for freedom, for also job, against corruption, against the regime, for the separation between religion and state, and so on and so forth. But what is peculiar is that this time you have, as I mentioned, different parts of Iran and different ethnicities that are involved. And also what we can see is that probably for the first time also we are faced with a new definition of who is Iranian. because up to now, actually in the dominant discourses, those who were Shiites were basically considered as Iranians, or those who under the previous regime were Persians were more Iranians than others. But today, the discourse emerging out of this movement, revolutionary process, is that everybody is. So these are all instances of peculiar instances that we did not have before. This is one thing. And the other thing is that, and this is very important, that many of the people who are today in the protest movement have already also, maybe not them, but their parents, have voted for reformers, for instance, with the hope of changing the system from within, and basically they failed, and they saw that if many people who participated in the Green Movement, many people who also led the Green Movement, such as Mr. Mousavi himself, are now saying change is not possible within this, reforms are not possible, and we can't change the regime from within, so we have to change the entire institutions and the entire system. Nonetheless, I think that if you don't see military or what we call qeshr khakestari, or the silent majority in the streets yet, although they are also very discontent, it is because we don't have any viable alternative, political alternative yet. And so people, those who have jobs, those who have a family and the responsibility of their family and so on, cannot just risk all this, all their whatever they have to take the streets and protest physically. But we know, and there are several polls taken in Iran that show that even these people are very discontent and dissatisfied with the regime, and I don't want to say regime change because it reminds me of Trump, but a change actually. So I think this is very different, and so this is not just another movement. I think that the willingness to really change the entire institutions, leaders, and so on is really very, very important today, comparing to the previous movements I just mentioned.
Thank you so much, Professor Kian. I think you explained to us the whole complexity of the issue very nicely in such an amazing time. We still have about 20 to 25 minutes, and I want to ask our other speakers if they want to weigh in. Otherwise, we have questions for each of you, which I can read out to you. Before doing that, I can also cite Professor Ehteshami's piece that was published by our media partner, Global Policy Journal, that is based on a conference I think that you had in Durham, writing about the uprising in Iran. And if I may quote the gist of it, you said that it's a democratizing uprising that is underway in Iran, as the regime is confronted by a perfect storm consisting of 3 interconnected cyclones, a socioeconomic crisis, a political impasse, and international isolation. And I think all of those cyclones and crises weigh heavily and have important ramifications for the livelihood of millions of Iranians. So if you want to get in on this question, please do so now. Otherwise, I'm going to go over to the questions that were addressed to each of you. The question that, so perhaps we can start with, Nadine, there is a question about Erdogan, so I'm not sure if you want to respond to that. The question is, to what extent could Erdogan remaining in power impact freedom and democracy in the region, especially women's rights?
So can you repeat it? So
Yes. So it's about Erdogan. So it's about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president. So to what extent could him remaining in power impact freedom and democracy in the Middle East, especially women's rights?
yeah. Okay. So actually, I don't think that this should have a great impact. I don't see that this has like a direct impact of causality. So my opinion is that the internal factors have more a weight in the countries, as every country has its own internal factors, and this play a major role in how it's going on with women's rights and others. So I'm not sure that there will be great impact about
Sure.
this. And I think that there is another question for me regarding also
Yes.
the.
Exactly.
May I just
yeah.
say, try to answer? I'm sorry. I've been working
Sure.
on women's
Please
rights,
get it.
women's movements in Turkey for the past many years, and I think that the Erdogan government, ever since 2012, have started really attacking women's rights. And for instance, we have seen many signs of these attacks and this willingness, which is also the willingness of the conservative members of the AKP, who are really the ones who vote for Erdogan, to restrict and limit women's rights in Turkey. So my understanding is that if he is re-elected, and it seems that he will be, because the nationalist, ultra-nationalist candidate also said that he will vote for Erdogan. So it means that women's rights will be further limited, and really they have to struggle further and further in order to at least keep their rights, and it will have also an impact on the region, especially on countries that are immediate neighbors of Turkey, that is Iran and Iraq. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that unfortunately they will have impacts also on women's rights in these countries.
Yeah, but in a country like Egypt, so this could
no,
not.
you're not an immediate neighbor, and you probably are not in, you know how many Iranians go to Turkey or live in Turkey. This has nothing to do with Egypt, you know. I do understand.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So since Anoush has to leave at 6, so I'm gonna pose your other question to Nadine later if she agrees. So we're gonna go to Anoush because there are a few questions for him. Let me have a look. So there are 2 questions. One is about, you know, do you believe the Iran-Saudi deal that you mentioned? And the question is, do you believe that China must be considered as the main and only winner of the so-called Iran-Saudi Arabia normalization?
What was the first one, Ali?
So this is the first one. Is can China be considered as the main and only winner of the Iran-Saudi deal?
Right. Secretary of State Blinken actually went on record saying they were in favor of the deal. Anything that can contain Iran was seen to be a good thing. And so I don't see this as creating rifts at this stage, only if it leads to further developments that would shift Saudi Arabia's position on broader American interests in the region. I don't see that happening as such. But from the US's perspective, if China is in a position to moderate Iran and reduce tensions by opening up diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, improving economic relations between Iran and the Emirates, then objectively, that is not in America's, it's not something that's not in America's interest. They would welcome this in a sense. They don't see it as contrary to efforts to stabilize Iran. What they don't want to see is Iran's empowerment. That's a different issue altogether. China has not yet managed to empower Iran because of the sanctions that remain in place. There are now talks about Emirates trying to find ways of working around the sanctions on Iran, but these are all actually marginal. As Azadeh said, you know, the economic impact of sanctions remains strong, but also they're being, if you like, complemented by the sheer incompetence of Iran's economic and political decision makers. So if Iran emerges as a regional power to threaten American interests, that's a very different thing to efforts to moderate Iran's behavior regionally.
Thank you, dear Anoush. There's a second question to you by our associate fellow Lisa Marie Geltinger, who asks, can you already estimate which impact the demographic transition in China, which is with a fertility rate at an all-time low, will have on the economic shift from the Euro-Atlantic to the East? Can the pendulum swing again?
Right. Demographies have a way of changing economic policies, and with the decline in Japan, in Italy, and so on, you can see that they have a very kind of direct impact on thinking at the decision-making level. But it's one thing for Japan and Italy to lose, or Russia to lose population, is another for China's billion-plus people for that to begin to manifest itself in economic policy changes. What it will do, though, it will accelerate the use of technology in development and industrialization and post-industrial policies, and that we are already beginning to see with regard to China's AI development. So I think it is a long-term concern. We have seen what it has done to Japan. Also, it has had an impact on its economic development and growth model. But I think China is still a long way from that. And by the time that China begins to feel the effect of this, and it's not just about the loss of young people, it's about sustaining life for the older people, because it reduces the country's ability to generate resource and income. That is a problem with population decline. China, for the moment at least, is able to externalize that as an issue, but it's something that they'll have to begin to think about by the end of this century, certainly.
Thank you so much, Professor Ehteshami. We have two questions for Professor Kian, and I think one question still for Dr. Abdalla. I'm going to start maybe with Professor Kian, which is the first question. Second, to what extent is the Generation Z ready to pay the price? What are they looking for exactly? And what is the difference? What is their difference with the previous uprisings, such as the Green Movement? So the first question is about the Generation Z and how much they're ready to pay the price, whatever that involves. Second is about the various activities among communities in the diaspora. The question is, are the various activities among communities in the diaspora scientifically assessed? Is there research that gives information on the motivations, needs, backgrounds, conflicts that occur within the diaspora communities, and how this affects a revolution inside Iran? So I'm not sure if you have a question for the second one, but the floor is yours. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you for these questions. The Generation Z has already given a lot, because if you look at the 530 people who were killed during the demonstrations, and also those tens of those who lost their eyes, either one eye or both, are really are from this Generation Z. And these are the ones who, and we also saw a lot of schoolgirls in their own schools who demonstrated and so on against the regime, against the leader, and so on and so forth. So they are really very, very courageous, and I think that one of their slogans is that we will never return to where we were before September. So it means that they absolutely are airing demands and want freedom. This is the first thing they're demanding, freedom, but also social justice, depending, of course, because this is not a homogeneous movement. Of course, you have people from middle classes, urban middle classes, you have urban poor, you have people from Tehran, but also from Baluchistan or Kurdish towns and so on. So they are not saying, they are not necessarily having the same demands, but I think that the ones they share is social justice. It is against political Islam, for the separation of religion and the state, and of course freedom and social justice. These are demands that are shared by everyone. And this generation Z, again, is a generation that really grew up with social media in Iran. If you look at the statistics on the spread of the social media in Iran and internet, is absolutely amazing. In 1994, for instance, only 250 people had access to internet. Today, over 75% of the Iranian population has access to internet. So it means a lot of people that I have seen also in the villages with their smartphones, who have also access to the social media, and so their minds and their way of doing politics are also being set or formed by their access to the social media, that is, to the world. So they are very different from previous ones who, for instance, took part in the Green Movement. And I think that they will not accept to go back to stay at home and forget about their demands for change, actually. The second question, with regard to diaspora, we don't still have, as far as I know, scientific work on them. I mean, on the current activities of the Iranian diaspora. We know who they are. We know who left Iran when, and we have different waves of people who left Iran from 1979 onwards, but I have not yet seen any scientific work yet on the diaspora. I'm not sure if I got the question right, actually. The second question, I mean. Exactly. But what we know, I just wanted to say, as we all know, that there are a lot of divisions within, of course, the diaspora, within those who want to lead at least the diaspora and so on. But one should not forget that this is the first time during the past 44 years that these people are talking to each other and having a dialogue. So part of these divisions, I believe, is quite normal. But my understanding, and for this very reason, I talked about autonomous trade unions in Iran and autonomous councils, the 20 ones who also issued a declaration several times, are the ones who will be decisive for the future of Iran, not those who are in the diaspora.
Thank you so much. And I'm very intrigued to ask Nadine an additional question. So you have one question, which is about the role that the West, especially the United States, has played during the Arab Spring. And the second is that I know that you're talking to a lot of people. So what is the, I mean, Arab perceptions sounds a bit awkward, but you probably know what I mean. In terms of the developments that are ongoing in Iran. So how are you observing this, and how are you reading it? So I would be very much curious to know about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali. So I'll start with the first question, and then I'll come back to your interesting question. So for the West and for the US, role in the Arab uprising, especially in Egypt. So basically, I think that they were taken by surprise when the when the revolution in Egypt started. So I can see a special role in the first year following the uprising in Egypt. However, when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in 2012, things changed dramatically. So I think that there was a clear support for the Muslim Brotherhood arriving to power, and I think that there is two reasons behind this support. First is that they thought that since there was elections and they were freely elected, then this should be something that should be respected and should be supported. In that case, on one hand, it is right that they come freely to power, and this is part of what democracy is. However, what is not democracy is that there were no agreement on the rules of the game at the first place, and this was a problem. Second, the US were already, a lot of think tanks in the US were working on the idea of the integration of the moderate Islamists on the political process. So when the Muslim Brotherhood arrived to power, they thought that, voila, this is it. So their work on Islamist is embodied by the access of power to of the Muslim Brotherhood to power. However, they forgot that the version of the Muslim Brotherhood that arrived to power was the conservative version, not the moderate within the Muslim Brotherhood group. So I think it's very, very interesting to dig further into this. I have wrote already in Arabic a lot of articles on this. But to make it brief that it is, then we go to the other era where we had Trump. And I think that the vision of Trump in relation to democratic governance and so on is clear. So we don't need to delve deeper into it. So I think that their role was not that efficient, but we can also talk more about it because there is a lot to be said. I think that there was also the question regarding to the diaspora, and I would like to tell to say that there is now a lot of work related to the diaspora in Egypt. So that the Egyptian diaspora abroad, a lot of researchers are working on this, especially that now we have a new diaspora abroad. So previously it was more about economic reasons, but now we have a new diaspora that is going abroad because of political reasons, but also because lifestyle reasons, which are related to the uprisings and the aspiration of the youth that were not met. Finally, for your question, Ali, actually, in Egypt, for instance, there was a great interest in what is happening in Iran. I had, for example, my students in the American University in Cairo, a lot of them were making the research paper. They choose to make the research paper on women and the women's rights and all what's happening in Iran lately. There was a lot of articles that were written in the newspapers about this, and even people were talking about it. There was a lot of empathy about it, and it was a great debate, and it continued to be.
Thank you, Dr. Abdalla. Very, very interesting. So we have 4 minutes left. So I would, propose that we're going to end soon, although we could discuss till midnight and beyond all those amazing topics. But I'm sure that we're going to have more, options to do that, more chances to do that in the future with all of our great speakers today. And I'm sure you're going to join me in thanking them for their most fascinating talks and insights into the key transformations that are going on so multiple levels that can indeed be called historical. And we're going to continue looking at it from CMEG's work. And we're going to also offer a number of publications on it. And last but not least, before I forget, let me remind you that we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And also we have a YouTube channel that you can check out to see the recording of this session. Today, in a week's time, we're going to have our next webinar that's going to look into our so-called Iran Futures flagship program with our core Iranian team, our senior fellows that span all relevant disciplines. In terms of Iran, we're going to have Behrouz Bayat, who is a former advisor to the IAEA, a nuclear expert, talking about the nuclear issue. We're going to have Azadeh Pourzand, who is going to look at the state of civil society and human rights in Iran. We're going to have Dr. Shirin Hakim, who is a specialist on the environmental crisis in Iran. And last but not least, we're going to have Dr. Mahdi Qudsi, who is an economist in Vienna, and we're going to look at the state of Iran's economic crisis. So thank you again so much, Professor Kian, Professor Ehteshami, Dr. Abdalla from Cairo for your time and support and for your amazing insights, and would be most grateful to welcome you again at one of our next sessions. So thank you again very much, and I wish you a wonderful day or evening.